The fabric kept scraping against my collarbone every time I moved. I pulled at the neckline for the 5th time in less than a minute, hoping it would somehow become more comfortable. It didn't. The pale peach chiffon felt cheap in all the wrong places and delicate in all the useless ones. Whoever designed this dress had clearly never considered the possibility that a woman might want to breathe, sit down, or turn her head without feeling like she was being gently sanded alive. I stared at myself in the mirror and almost laughed. The dress looked like it belonged on a porcelain doll displayed in somebody's grandmother's glass cabinet. Not me. 3 feet away, hanging inside a navy garment bag, was the uniform I actually wanted to wear. I walked over and unzipped the bag halfway. The familiar scent of wool and dry cleaning solution hit me immediately. Heavy dark blue fabric, polished brass buttons, service ribbons aligned exactly where they belonged. My silver medical badge sat above the pocket, catching a thin strip of sunlight coming through the window. That badge wasn't decorative. I earned it. 8 years earlier, I spent nearly 6 hours helping pull wounded personnel from a collapsed structure after an attack in Helmand province. I still had a scar across my left shoulder from a concrete beam that decided gravity was more important than my plans for the day. The badge was easier to carry than the memories. I brushed my fingers across the fabric. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Mallory. My younger sister appeared in the doorway without knocking, holding her phone in one hand and a bottle of sparkling water in the other. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at herself through her front-facing camera. "Good," she said. "You're dressed." I glanced down. "That depends on your definition of good." She finally lowered the phone for about 2 seconds. Then she went back to checking her reflection. "You look pretty." The way she said it sounded less like a compliment and more like a quality control inspection. I smiled. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me all week." "I've been busy, I noticed." She laughed lightly and adjusted the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger. The ring had become its own family member during the past 11 months. Everybody talked about it. Nobody could stop looking at it. I was fairly certain it had its own zip code. Mallory noticed me glancing toward the garment bag. Her expression changed immediately. Not angry, annoyed, like she'd spotted a coffee stain on an expensive couch. "Corinne," I already knew the tone. "What? You aren't still thinking about wearing that, are you?" I looked at the uniform, then back at her. I asked 1 time. "You asked 4 times. Okay, 4. She sighed dramatically. The kind of sigh people use when customer service tells them their imported candles are delayed. "Corinne, it's just so aggressive." I blinked. "My uniform is aggressive? You know what I mean." "No. Actually, I don't." Mallory walked into the room and pointed toward the dress I was wearing. "This wedding has a very specific aesthetic." There it was, the word, aesthetic. During the past year, I had heard that word approximately 14,000 times. The invitations matched the aesthetic. The flowers matched the aesthetic. The napkins matched the aesthetic. The champagne labels matched the aesthetic. At one point, Mallory rejected 72 chairs because they didn't match the aesthetic. I counted. She crossed her arms. Pastels, soft lighting, elegance, romance. I waited. She pointed toward the garment bag. "That uniform ruins the palette. The palette. Not the atmosphere, not the ceremony, not the family dynamic. The palette." I almost admired the honesty. Almost. I looked at her carefully. "That's 12 years of my life in that bag." She shifted uncomfortably. For a second, I thought maybe the message had landed. Then she shrugged. "I know." No, she didn't. Not really. Knowing and understanding are very different things. Mallory knew my rank. She knew my deployment history. She knew I was a combat medic. But she understood those things the same way somebody understands the ingredients list on a cereal box. The information existed. That was it. She checked her phone again. "I just want everything to look beautiful." I nodded slowly, and that's when something clicked. Not loudly, quietly, the way a door closes when nobody notices. This wasn't really about a dress. It wasn't about colors. It wasn't even about the uniform. My family wasn't embarrassed by what I had done. They were embarrassed by what it represented. The uniform reminded people that real life existed outside curated photographs. It reminded people that pain existed. Sacrifice existed, consequences existed, and none of those things matched pastel centerpieces. The realization settled in without drama. No argument, no yelling, no tears, just clarity. I looked back at the mirror. The peach chiffon scratched my skin. The diamond rings sparkled under the light. My uniform waited quietly inside its garment bag, and somehow the most uncomfortable thing in the room wasn't the dress. It was knowing exactly where I fit inside my own family's priorities, right behind the color scheme. Have you ever accomplished something you were proud of, only to have the people closest to you act like it was inconvenient? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, family, and the moments that reveal who people really are, remember our new stories premiere every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Make us part of your daily routine, and I'll see you at the next premiere. Mallory smiled at her reflection one last time before heading toward the door. Perfect, she said. Then she left the room. I looked at the uniform again, and for the first time all morning, I stopped reaching for the collar of the dress. I zipped the garment bag shut and followed the sound of voices downstairs. The Grand Beaumont estate sat on nearly 40 acres outside Richmond, and every square foot seemed determined to remind people how expensive it was. The driveway curved around a stone fountain that probably cost more than my first house. Valets in tailored black jackets moved luxury SUVs with military-level efficiency. Somewhere nearby, a string quartet was already warming up. Nothing says romance quite like a violinist practicing scales next to a six-figure flower budget. The moment I stepped inside, I smelled orchids, not the normal kind, imported orchids, the kind that arrive with paperwork. The ballroom staff was still making final adjustments. Florists were carrying arrangements taller than some middle school students. Event planners walked around holding tablets and looking mildly terrified. Everybody seemed one small inconvenience away from a nervous breakdown. Perfect. My family loved perfection, or at least the appearance of it. I followed signs toward the bridal suite and immediately heard my mother's voice before I reached the door. No, no, no. The photographer needs the veil angled from the left. A pause. Because the right side photographs better. Another pause. Trust me. When I stepped inside, the room looked less like a preparation area and more like a command center. Hairstylists, makeup artists, photographers, videographers, assistants. 3 people whose jobs I genuinely could not identify. Mallory stood in the center of the room like the sun in a very expensive solar system. Everyone orbited around her. My mother, Deirdre, adjusted a section of lace near Mallory's shoulder and took 3 steps back. Then 2 steps forward, then 1 step sideways. She looked like she was defusing a bomb. My father, Arthur, stood near a window practicing actual handshakes, over and over, firm grip, smiles, release, repeat. I watched him rehearse on absolutely nobody for nearly 20 seconds. Politics. The groom's family lived and breathed it. Mallory wasn't just marrying Ethan Kensington. She was marrying into a family that treated charity galas like professional sports. The Kensingtons knew senators, governors, media executives, people who had assistants for their assistants. To my parents, this wedding wasn't just a wedding, it was a promotion. My father finally noticed me. Corin. He nodded approvingly, not at me. At the dress. Good choice. I almost asked which part of the decision had been mine. Instead, I smiled politely. 12 years in the army teaches you that silence is often the most efficient response. My mother turned around. The second she saw me, her shoulders relaxed, actually relaxed. Like she had been worried about something all morning and suddenly received good news. Oh, thank goodness. For what? She walked over and patted my arms. See? You look so normal. Normal. There it was. A single word. 7 letters. It landed harder than I expected. Not because she meant to be cruel. That would have been easier. Cruelty at least acknowledges your existence. This was different. To my mother, it was a compliment. She genuinely thought she was helping. That somehow made it worse. I glanced around the room. Nobody reacted. Nobody even noticed. Mallory was busy reviewing photos from a rehearsal dinner. A makeup artist was discussing lighting. A photographer was adjusting camera settings. Life continued normally. Apparently, I was the only person who heard the problem. Normal. Not respected, not accomplished, not dedicated, not brave. Normal. As if the version of me they preferred was the one that looked less like me. Mallory finally looked up from her phone. Oh good. The dress works. The dress works? I asked. She nodded. It blends. There was that word again. Blend. The same goal she'd given me yesterday. Blend in. Disappear politely. Become decorative. I looked around the room. Mission accomplished. Nobody was asking about deployments. Nobody was asking about emergency medicine. Nobody was asking about the military. Nobody was asking about anything remotely connected to my actual life. I had become wallpaper. Expensive wallpaper, but wallpaper nonetheless. A woman carrying a garment steamer nearly bumped into me. She apologized, then immediately asked if I worked for the venue. I laughed. She wasn't even being rude. I was literally standing in a corner, holding a garment bag while everyone else looked important. I don't work here, I said. She looked embarrassed. I'm so sorry. It's okay. Honestly, it was the funniest conversation I'd had all morning. Across the room, Mallory was discussing seating arrangements. Apparently, one donor's wife couldn't sit near another donor's wife because of an argument that started during a yacht fundraiser 18 months earlier. I wish I were making that up. Meanwhile, I spent most of my adult life treating gunshot wounds, yet somehow yacht politics felt more dangerous. A young assistant hurried into the room carrying a printed seating chart. Mallory grabbed it immediately. Did Table 7 get moved? Yes. And the Kensington family friends from Charleston? Table 3. And Senator Caldwell? Front center. Mallory nodded with visible relief. Everything had a place. Everything had a ranking. Everything had a purpose. Except me. I wasn't seated near the family because they wanted me close. I was seated there because family photographs required a complete set. The realization didn't hurt in a dramatic way. It felt familiar, like hearing a song you've known your whole life. I remembered birthday parties where Mallory got the spotlight because she was prettier. Family dinners where my deployment became uncomfortable conversation topics. Holiday gatherings where relatives asked about my sister's social media career and forgot to ask where I'd spent the previous year. Nobody ever said they were ashamed. They didn't have to. People reveal their priorities through repetition. And my family's priorities had always been remarkably consistent. A photographer suddenly clapped his hands. Family portrait in 10 minutes. Everyone moved at once. My mother rushed toward Mallory. My father adjusted his tie. Assistant scattered. The room exploded into activity. I stepped aside to stay out of the way. Nobody noticed. For the first time that morning, I realized something important. They hadn't invited the real version of me to this wedding. They had invited a quieter version. A simpler version. A version that wouldn't disrupt the picture they were trying to sell. And standing there surrounded by imported flowers, political connections, and enough wealth to fund a small hospital, I started wondering whether being invisible might actually be the easiest job in the building. I shifted 2 steps away from the photographers and let a bridesmaid carrying a bouquet take my place. Nobody noticed the difference. That turned out to be useful. The ceremony itself unfolded exactly the way Mallory had planned it. Every flower was in the correct location. Every ribbon matched something else. Every guest seemed to know where to stand and when to smile. The wedding coordinator moved through the crowd with an earpiece and the expression of a woman preventing an international crisis. Honestly, I respected her. She was handling 312 guests, 6 vendors, a string quartet, 2 politicians, and 1 nervous groom. I'd seen less complicated military operations. I sat through the ceremony without incident. Mallory looked happy. I should be clear about that. For all my frustrations, she genuinely looked happy. When she walked down the aisle, she wasn't thinking about me. She wasn't thinking about uniforms. She wasn't thinking about family politics. She was looking at Ethan. And for a few minutes, the performance disappeared. What remained was real. I was glad for her. The problem wasn't that Mallory was incapable of sincerity. The problem was that she only made room for it when it involved herself. The applause erupted after the vows. People stood. Champagne appeared almost immediately. Somewhere behind me, a guest loudly announced that the floral arrangements alone were an investment. Nothing says romance like discussing flowers as a financial asset. The reception began shortly afterward inside the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead. White linen covered every table. The place cards had gold lettering. Each dinner menu had been printed on thick imported paper that probably cost more than my monthly internet bill. I found my assigned seat near the head table. Family seating, prime location, exact where I was supposed to be. I sat down. Then I looked around. A senator was already working the room. 3 local television personalities had arrived. Several members of the Kensington family were discussing campaign fundraising numbers. My mother was glowing. My father looked like he had just been accepted into a country club he couldn't previously afford. Mallory sat at the center of it all. Beautiful, celebrated, photographed every 30 seconds. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and suddenly I understood something. The front row wasn't a reward. It was a cage. If I stayed there all evening, I would spend the next 5 hours pretending. Pretending not to hear the comments. Pretending not to notice the priorities. Pretending not to feel like a prop. I had spent 12 years treating trauma patients. I knew the difference between discomfort and damage. This felt like damage. Not dramatic damage, quiet damage. The kind that happens one small compromise at a time. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, set it down. Then I stood up. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked where I was going. A woman at the neighboring table was busy explaining the differences between 3 varieties of imported champagne. Apparently, that conversation required immediate attention. I slipped away from the ballroom and followed a service hallway toward the back of the estate. The farther I walked, the quieter the performance became. The music faded. The speeches disappeared. The smell of expensive perfume gave way to something much better. Dinner, roasted garlic, fresh bread, coffee, actual life. I pushed through a set of swinging service doors and entered the catering corridor. The atmosphere changed instantly. People were moving fast. Servers carried trays, kitchen staff shouted updates, dishwashers rattled, managers checked schedules. Nobody cared about social status. Nobody cared about political connections. Everybody cared about one thing: getting dinner served on time. My kind of people. A woman in a black catering jacket glanced at me. "You lost?" I laughed. "Maybe." She pointed toward the ballroom. "Fancy parties that way." I know, she studied me for a second. Then she noticed I wasn't leaving. "You need something?" I looked around. Years of military habit kicked in automatically. I saw bottleneck, traffic flow issues, timing conflicts, one serving station falling behind schedule, nothing catastrophic, just operational friction, the universal language of organized chaos. I nodded toward a stack of meal cards. "You need help?" The woman blinked. "Help? Yeah." She stared at the bridesmaid dress, then at me, then back at the dress. "You know how to work an event?" I smiled. "I've coordinated medical evacuations involving helicopters, armored vehicles, and 3 different chains of command." She considered that. Fair point. 5 minutes later, I was helping organize delivery timing between kitchen stations and serving teams. 10 minutes later, I was directing traffic around a congested service entrance. 15 minutes later, somebody handed me a clipboard. That's how every military career starts. Someone gives you his responsibility, and nobody remembers exactly why. The corridor was hot. The air smelled like roasted beef, butter, garlic, and industrial dish soap. Servers moved constantly. Kitchen timers beeped. Orders were called out. It was loud. It was imperfect. It was honest. And for the first time all day, I felt comfortable. Nobody here cared about my dress. Nobody here cared about aesthetics. Nobody cared whether I matched the centerpieces. They cared whether Table 12 received the vegetarian meals before Table 15. A refreshingly achievable objective. At one point, a young server rushed over looking panicked. "We have a seating change at Table 9. How many guests?" 3. "Any dietary restrictions?" 1 shellfish allergy. Move the replacement plates before the next service. Wave. She nodded and sprinted off. Problem solved. Simple, useful, real. I glanced through a small circular window built into one of the kitchen doors. Inside the ballroom, the reception continued. Champagne glasses sparkled. Photographers circled the head table. Guests laughed. Everything looked flawless. Exactly the way my family wanted it. I didn't feel angry anymore. Just distant. Like I was watching a movie from behind the screen. They could keep the spotlight. They could keep the photographs. They could keep the perfect color palette. Meanwhile, standing in a service corridor, with a clipboard in one hand and a vendor schedule in the other, I had finally found something they couldn't manufacture. Peace. A burst of applause drifted through the kitchen doors, louder than anything I'd heard all evening. The catering manager looked up from her tablet. "Well," she said, "the celebrity finally showed up." One of the servers stopped carrying plates long. "Enough to ask, movie star?" The manager shook her head.
"Horsers?"
"A prince." That got everyone's attention, even in a kitchen. I walked over to the small round window built into the swinging service door and looked inside the ballroom. The change was immediate. The reception had already been expensive before. Now it looked important. Guests who had spent the last hour pretending not to care about status suddenly cared very much. Conversations stopped midway through sentences. People adjusted jackets. Women checked their hair in phone screens. Several guests casually repositioned themselves closer to the entrance in a maneuver, so obvious it deserved its own Olympic category. social climbing at competitive levels. Near the ballroom entrance stood Prince Bastian of Hesse, tall, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, perfectly tailored tuxedo. The kind of presence that didn't require an introduction because everyone instinctively knew who he was. What most people saw was royalty. What I saw was posture, military posture. You learn to recognize it. Certain habits never disappear. The way he scanned a room, the way he positioned himself near exits, the way he shook hands while remaining aware of everything happening around him. That wasn't palace training, that was field training. One of the younger servers leaned beside me. I thought princes were supposed to look softer. I laughed. So did Disney. The server snorted and went back to work. Inside the ballroom, Prince Bastian moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. He smiled when appropriate, accepted greetings, shook hands, posed for photographs. But there was something mechanical about it. Not rude, just disciplined. Like a man completing a task. The Kensington family practically floated across the floor toward him. Ethan's father reached him first. Then Ethan. Then various relatives appeared from every direction. The photographers looked thrilled. A royal guest transformed an expensive wedding into a newsworthy event. I could practically hear the headlines forming. My mother certainly could. She materialized beside the prince within 30 seconds. My father wasn't far behind. Neither was Mallory. Watching them approach was almost impressive. They moved with the precision of a tactical unit. Except instead of securing a strategic objective, they were securing photographs. The string quartet shifted into something elegant and dramatic. Champagne towers sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Waiters circulated with silver trays. The entire room looked like a luxury magazine advertisement. Exactly the image they had spent months building. Exactly the image they wanted everyone to see. The manager beside me glanced through the window. "That's your family, right?" "Unfortunately, yes." She laughed. They look excited. That's one word for it. My mother reached Prince Bastian first. I couldn't hear the conversation through the door, but I knew her smile. It was her important people smile. The one reserved for politicians, donors, and anyone whose name appeared in newspapers. My father immediately joined the interaction. Arthur Aldridge had spent the previous 6 months practicing introductions for moments exactly like this. Apparently, the investment was paying off. Flash, flash, flash. Cameras everywhere. The photographers were working harder than the bartenders. Mallory positioned herself beside the prince for another photo, then another, then another. If photographs generated electricity, the estate could have powered half of Virginia. I should have looked away. Instead, I kept watching, partly because it was entertaining, partly because I had nowhere else to be, and partly because something felt unusual. Prince Bastian was smiling, but not with his eyes. His attention kept moving, not wandering, searching, a subtle difference. The kitchen staff continued working around me. Trays moved, orders were called, dishes rattled. Yet every few minutes I found myself glancing back through the window. The prince remained polite, patient, professional, but increasingly distracted, as though he expected someone, or noticed someone was missing. The ballroom kept growing louder. Word of his arrival spread quickly. Guests from distant tables suddenly discovered reasons to pass nearby. Several local politicians appeared out of nowhere. One state senator nearly knocked over a floral arrangement, trying to reach the VIP section. Ambition can be surprisingly clumsy. The catering manager looked over my shoulder again. "Big deal?" I nodded. Former NATO coalition commander. Her eyebrows lifted. Seriously, seriously. That got her attention. Even people who didn't care about royalty understood military leadership. Especially at that level. She looked back through the window. "Interesting. What, your family sees a prince?" I smiled. "And?" She shrugged. "You see a commander." That stopped me for a second. Because she was right. The title wasn't what caught my attention. The rank did. The ballroom saw prestige. I saw experience. Most guests probably knew Prince Bastian from society magazines. I knew the type of people who served under commanders like him. I knew the cost of the decisions they made. The ballroom admired his status. I respected the weight he carried. Very different things. Inside the reception hall, another round of photographs began again. My mother looked happier than I'd seen her all year. My father looked ready to frame every image before the wedding even ended. Mallory practically glowed. This was the final piece. The perfect ending to the perfect event. A royal guest, political connections, luxury venue, flawless photographs, everything aligned. every detail carefully controlled, every imperfection removed, every distraction hidden, including me. I glanced down at the clipboard in my hand. A schedule adjustment for dessert service needed approval. A server was waiting for instructions. Real work. I turned away from the window and helped solve the problem. 5 minutes later, another. Then another. The kitchen kept moving. The ballroom kept celebrating. Two completely different worlds separated by a pair of swinging doors. One built on appearances. One built on results. Neither side realized they were about to collide. Because while my family was busy introducing themselves to a prince, they had overlooked one very important detail. Prince Bastian of Hesse might have worn a crown, but long before that, he had worn a uniform. I handed the revised dessert schedule back to the catering manager and reached for a bottle of water. Before I could take a sip, one of the servers pushed through the kitchen doors carrying an empty tray. His eyes were wide. Something weird is happening out there. That was a dangerous sentence at a wedding. Weird how? I asked. The server shrugged. Royalty weird. That narrowed it down considerably. He disappeared before I could ask another question. A few moments later, two waiters entered carrying used champagne glasses. They immediately started talking, not quietly. People in event service rarely talk quietly. The prince asked a question. What question? I don't know. Something about somebody's daughter. That got my attention. I looked toward the small round window again. The ballroom no longer sounded quite the same. The music continued, the conversations continued, but underneath it all was a different energy. Subtle, curious. Like guests had collectively noticed something unexpected. I stepped closer to the door. Not because I was interested. Because I was absolutely interested. Through the glass, I could see Prince Bastian seated at the VIP table near the center of the ballroom. The photographers had finally backed off. The champagne had been poured. Dinner service was beginning. Everything should have settled down. Instead, the prince was leaning slightly toward my father. Arthur sat rigidly in his chair. Too rigid. I knew that posture. I'd seen it on junior officers being questioned by generals. My father nodded once, then twice. Then his smile disappeared. Interesting. A server carrying dirty plates pushed through the doors. I stopped him. What's going on? He looked over his shoulder toward the ballroom. The prince is asking about somebody. Who? The server frowned. I didn't catch the full name. Then he snapped his fingers. A military person. My stomach tightened slightly. Not fear, recognition. The kind that appears before your brain finishes connecting pieces. Another server entered, then another. Each one brought fragments. Small pieces of a conversation moving through the ballroom. Like puzzle pieces arriving one at a time. Something about a daughter. Military rank. Father looked confused. Prince seemed serious. The kitchen staff started paying attention. Even the dishwashers slowed down. The ballroom might have been built on appearances, but service staff survive on information. And information was suddenly flowing. I walked back toward the window. This time I saw my mother. Deirdre had joined the conversation. That alone told me something was wrong. My mother never inserted herself into discussions unless she believed she could improve them. Or control them. Usually both. Prince Bastian spoke. My father answered. The prince spoke again, then I saw it. The exact moment. Arthur's face lost color, not dramatically, not enough for most guests to notice, but I noticed. I've spent years monitoring patients. You learn to see changes as others miss. His jaw tightened, his eyes shifted, his smile became forced. A few seconds later, another waiter entered the kitchen carrying empty wine glasses. This one had details. Actual details. The prince asked where the older daughter is. I froze. The waiter continued. Said her name and everything. The room suddenly felt much quieter. What name? I asked. The waiter looked at me. Corinne. Nobody spoke for a second. Then the waiter added the part that mattered. He called her Sergeant First Class Aldridge. The silence deepened. Several members of the catering staff slowly turned toward me. I looked away from them and back toward the ballroom, because suddenly I understood exactly what was happening. Prince Bastian knew who I was, not vaguely, not socially, not through my family. He knew my rank. A rank most civilians couldn't identify if it were printed on a billboard. My mother appeared visibly unsettled now. Even through the glass I could see it. She laughed. A little too quickly. Then she waved her hand. That familiar gesture. The one people use when trying to minimize something. Or someone. I couldn't hear her exact words. But a few moments later, another server arrived with the missing pieces. Your mom said you're around somewhere. I nodded slowly. The server continued. Said you're shy. That almost made me laugh. Shy. I spent years arguing with helicopter pilots about landing zones. I've treated patients while rockets were falling nearby. I've yelled medical instructions across active evacuation sites. Nobody has ever accused me of being shy. The waiter wasn't finished. She also said you're not really into high society. Now I actually laughed. A short laugh. One sharp breath. Because that part was true. I wasn't interested in high society. I just wasn't interested for the reasons she thought. To my mother, high society meant influence, status, access. To me, it mostly looked like expensive insecurity. Across the ballroom, my parents appeared relieved. The conversation seemed over. My father smiled again. My mother lifted her champagne glass. Mallory returned to the table. Everything looked normal. Problem solved. Question answered. Move along. That was clearly what they expected. They expected Prince Bastien to nod politely. Take a sip of champagne. Accept the explanation. Continue being the crown jewel of the reception. Because that's what important guests usually do. They preserve the atmosphere. They avoid discomfort. They play their assigned role. Most people spend their lives protecting social illusions. My family certainly did. The problem was that Prince Bastien had spent most of his life somewhere very different. Places where reality mattered more than appearances. Places where excuses didn't stop bleeding. Places where rank wasn't decorative. Places where actions carried weight. I watched him carefully through the glass. The prince did not lift his champagne. He did not return to small talk. He did not smile. Instead, he sat perfectly still. Listening, thinking, evaluating. The same way a commander studies a report that doesn't make sense. And for the first time all evening, I saw genuine interest replace polite courtesy. Whatever answer my parents had given him wasn't enough, not even close. Because while the ballroom believed the conversation had ended, Prince Bastien looked like a man who had just discovered something missing from the room. And he wasn't the type of man who ignored missing pieces. The prince remained perfectly still. That was what caught my attention. Most people react when they're uncomfortable. They adjust their posture, reach for a drink, force a smile, change the subject. Prince Bastien did none of those things. He simply sat there, listening. Across the ballroom, my father was talking again. My mother occasionally added something. Mallory smiled at exactly the right moments. From a distance, it probably looked like a pleasant conversation. It wasn't. You could tell by the way nobody at that table touched their glasses. The catering corridor continued moving around me. Plates were loaded. Orders were called. Servers rushed in and out. Yet every person who passed through those doors seemed to return with another piece of the story. The ballroom had started paying attention, and once wealthy people become curious, they spread information faster than high school students. A server carrying empty wine glasses entered the kitchen. The prince isn't buying it. Another server followed behind him. He asked again. What did he ask? Somebody said. The answer came immediately. Where is Sergeant First Class Aldridge? Several members of the kitchen staff looked at me. I pretended to study a vendor timeline. Nobody believed me. Not even a little. Through the circular window, I watched Prince Bastien lean slightly forward. My father answered. The prince replied. Then something changed. Even from across the room, I saw it. The smile disappeared. Not gradually, instantly. The friendly royal guest vanished. The military commander appeared. I've seen that transition before. Commanders don't raise their voices when they're serious. They lower them. The ballroom seemed quieter now. The musicians were still playing. The guests were still eating. But conversations nearby had started fading. People sensed tension. Human beings are remarkably good at detecting it, even when they don't know why. A waiter rushed through the doors carrying an empty tray. The prince said something about a transport vehicle. My eyes narrowed. Now I was paying attention. The waiter continued. Your father looked like he got hit with a shovel. Another server nearly dropped her stack of plates. What happened? The waiter shook his head. I didn't hear everything. Then he paused. I heard him say she pulled 2 men out. The room fell silent, not because anyone understood the details, because they understood the reaction. Prince wasn't discussing table settings. He wasn't discussing social events. He was talking about something real. And suddenly the ballroom's carefully constructed hierarchy wasn't operating the way people expected. I moved closer to the door. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to watch. Prince Bastien was speaking now, slowly, directly. My father wasn't smiling anymore, neither was my mother. For the first time all evening, they looked completely unprepared, which made sense. You can rehearse introductions. You can rehearse photographs. You can rehearse conversations about politics. You cannot rehearse a conversation you never expected to have, especially one happening in front of 300 guests. A server slipped into the kitchen carrying used dinner plates. His eyes looked enormous. He called her a hero. Nobody spoke. The server continued. Right in front of everybody, I looked back through the glass. Several nearby tables had stopped eating. People were pretending not to stare. A skill wealthy people never master as well as they think. The attention was spreading. One table, then two, then five, like ripples moving across water. Mallory noticed it too. I could see her turning in her chair, looking around, calculating. Managing appearances had always been her greatest talent, and appearances were suddenly becoming unstable. She stood up, smiled, adjusted part of her wedding gown, then moved toward the prince. I knew that smile, damage control smile, the same one she'd used when a florist delivered the wrong shade of roses, the same one she'd used when a photographer accidentally posted an unedited image, the same one she'd used whenever reality interrupted her plans. She approached the table gracefully, elegant, confident, composed, the perfect bride. From where I stood, I couldn't hear every word, but I knew the strategy immediately: redirect, distract, recover. A few seconds later, another waiter entered the kitchen. She's trying to introduce him to a senator. I laughed. Of course she was. In Mallory's world, senators fixed everything. Bad publicity, awkward conversations, social tension. Need a distraction? Find a politician. Apparently that was the plan. The problem was that Prince Bastien didn't seem interested, not remotely. The waiter continued watching through the doorway. Then he blinked. Wow. What? Somebody asked. The waiter looked stunned. He ignored her. Now everybody was watching. Kitchen staff, servers, managers, dishwashers, every single person. Because ignoring a bride at her own wedding was social suicide. Ignoring a bride while she's actively speaking to you was something else entirely. I looked through the window. Mallory had stopped smiling, only slightly, but enough. Prince Bastien wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at the senator approaching nearby. He wasn't looking at anyone except my parents. The ballroom had become very still. Guests were watching openly now. Nobody cared about dinner anymore. The entertainment had changed. Then Prince Bastien stood up. Every conversation stopped, not instantly, but close. A prince doesn't stand during formal dinner service without a reason. People noticed. The photographers noticed first. Their cameras immediately lifted. Several guests exchanged confused looks. My mother looked alarmed. My father looked trapped. Mallory looked terrified. Not because anyone had yelled. Not because anyone had caused a scene. Because something far more dangerous was happening. Control was disappearing. The prince stood straight, military straight. The kind of posture that leaves no room for misunderstanding. And even from behind a thick service door, I could feel the shift. This wasn't a social interaction anymore. This a direct one. A command disguised as a question. Then I saw his lips move, slowly, clearly. The words were impossible to miss. Where is she? Not a request, not curiosity, not small talk, an order. And judging by the expression spreading across my family's faces, they just realized the worst possible thing. The most important man in the building wasn't looking for a photograph. He was looking for me. The ice cubes shifted inside my glass as I turned toward the swinging doors. Something was coming, not a feeling, not intuition, evidence. The ballroom had gone strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that spreads through a crowd after something unexpected happens. A second later, the doors burst open, not dramatically, forcefully, like people moving with purpose. The first two men through the doorway weren't servers. They weren't wedding staff. They were security. Professional security. Dark suits. Earpieces. The kind of posture that immediately changes the temperature of a room. Every member of the kitchen staff froze. The dishwashers stopped. The servers stopped. Even the cooks looked up from the food. Behind the security detail came Prince Bastien. No photographers, no senator, no socialites, just the prince. And directly behind him came my parents, then Mallory. The contrast would have been funny if it weren't so uncomfortable. The prince walked with complete certainty. My family looked like passengers trying to catch a departing flight. My mother's face had lost all color. My father appeared 20 years older than he had an hour earlier. Mallory looked like someone had informed her that the wedding cake was on fire. No Baji spoke. The corridor suddenly felt very small. Prince Bastien stopped about 6 feet away from me. Not too close, not distant, military distance. I set my water glass on a nearby prep table. For a moment, neither of us said anything. His eyes moved briefly across the scene. The peach chiffon dress, the warming trays, the vendor schedules, the stainless steel counters, the staff members standing frozen beside carts of dinner plates. Then his gaze returned to me. And in that instant, I understood something. He understood exactly what had happened. Nobody had to explain it. Nobody had to tell him. He had walked through the ballroom, seen where I wasn't, seen where I was. That was enough. Years of command experience had probably made him very good at recognizing things people tried to hide. My mother finally found her voice. "Your Highness, we can return to the reception." He didn't even look at her. Not rude. Not angry. Simply uninterested. The sentence died halfway through. The silence that followed was brutal. Mallory attempted a smile. It lasted about 3 seconds, then disappeared. Nobody knew what to do, which made 2 of us. Because honestly, I wasn't entirely sure why Prince Bastien was standing in a catering corridor looking at me. The last time I'd seen him in person had been years ago. A deployment, a briefing, a helicopter landing zone, fragments. Military life tends to compress memories together. You remember the important parts. The rest becomes background noise. Prince Bastien took 1 step forward, then another, and suddenly I recognized him. Not the prince, the commander. The man standing in body armor near a temporary operations center, while exhausted medics rotated through casualty reports. Different clothes, same eyes. The realization landed quietly, just like everything important seemed to. Around us, the kitchen remained completely silent. The only sound came from an industrial refrigerator humming somewhere behind me. Then Prince Bastien did something nobody expected, including me. He brought his heels together. Sharp, precise. Every military veteran in the world recognizes that sound immediately. It isn't loud, but it carries. The prince straightened, shoulders back, chin level, perfect posture, formal posture, military posture. And before anyone could process what was happening, he raised his hand, a salute, flawless, textbook, not symbolic, not theatrical. A real salute, given with complete sincerity. The entire corridor froze. If the silence before had been heavy, this was something else entirely. My mother looked confused. My father looked stunned. Mallory looked like she had forgotten how breathing worked. The kitchen staff simply stared, because they didn't fully understand what they were seeing, but they understood it mattered. I returned the salute automatically. 12 years of training doesn't leave room for hesitation. Our hands dropped at the same moment. Prince Bastien spoke. Sergeant Aldridge. His voice echoed softly against the stainless steel walls. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. My men are alive because of you. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sentence hung in the air. Simple, direct. Impossible to misunderstand. I saw my mother's eyes widen. For the first time all day, she wasn't looking at me as Mallory's sister. She was looking at me as someone she apparently didn't know very well. The prince continued. I never had the opportunity to thank you properly. A memory surfaced. Dust, smoke, radio traffic, a damaged transport vehicle, 2 wounded coalition soldiers trapped inside. Years ago, another lifetime. I hadn't thought about that day in months, maybe years. To me, it was one mission among many. To someone else, it had clearly been something different. Prince Bastien glanced briefly toward my parents, not hostile, not accusing, which somehow made it worse. Then he looked back at me and delivered the sentence that broke whatever remained of the illusion inside that ballroom. I do not sit at a table where you are not seated. Nobody breathed. At least it felt that way. My father's shoulders collapsed slightly. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man suddenly realizing that the person he spent years overlooking was the only person in the building the prince actually came to see. Mallory looked completely lost. Not angry, not offended, lost. Because her entire understanding of status had just failed her. She had spent a year constructing the perfect wedding, the perfect venue, the perfect guest list, the perfect photographs. Yet none of it mattered. Not to the one guest whose opinion she valued most. The catering manager standing beside me whispered one word, "Wow." Honestly, that covered it. Prince Bastien extended his hand. Not a royal gesture, not a social gesture, a soldier's gesture. An equal's gesture, an invitation. And standing there between stacks of warming trays and carts full of dirty dishes, I realized something my family had never understood. Respect doesn't always appear in the front row. Sometimes it walks through the service entrance looking for the person everyone else overlooked. The prince's hand remained extended between us. Nobody moved. Not my mother, not my father, not Mallory, not even the kitchen staff. For a few seconds, the entire corridor felt suspended in place. The warming trays continued heating food. The refrigerator continued humming. Somewhere in the ballroom, silverware clinked against china. Life continued, yet everything had changed. I glanced toward my family, not because I wanted a reaction, because after all these years, it was impossible not to. My mother stood completely still. The confident woman who had spent the entire day directing photographers and arranging appearances suddenly looked lost, not embarrassed, not angry, lost. Her eyes moved from me to Prince Bastian and back again, as though she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't realize she'd been assembling incorrectly for years. My father looked even worse. Arthur Aldridge had spent most of his life believing status flowed in one direction, toward wealth, toward influence, toward important names, toward people with titles. And now one of the most important people he had ever met was standing in a catering corridor, refusing to return to the ballroom without me. That realization was doing visible damage. Mallory was staring at the floor. For the first time all day, she wasn't managing anything. No photographers, no seating charts, no image control, no aesthetic, just reality, and reality had terrible timing. Prince Bastian waited patiently, not pressuring me, not performing for the room, simply waiting. I looked down at the glass of ice water sitting beside me. The same glass I'd been holding when the doors opened. The same glass I'd been holding while my family's version of the evening unraveled. I set it down. Then I accepted his arm. The gesture was simple, nothing dramatic. No speech, no grand announcement, no victory lap, just a decision. The prince nodded once, and together we turned toward the ballroom. Behind us nobody spoke. Not a single word. The kitchen staff parted automatically as we walked. Several servers smiled. One of the cooks quietly muttered, "About time." Honestly, I appreciated that more than most of what happened that evening. The doors swung open. The ballroom saw us as immediately. 300 people can become silent surprisingly fast, especially when they believe they might be witnessing something important. The string quartet stopped playing mid-song. A photographer lowered his camera. Another immediately raised his professional instincts. The prince and I walked through the center of the room. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. I could feel hundreds of eyes following us. Normally, that would have made me uncomfortable. Strangely, it didn't, because for the first time all day, I wasn't being displayed. I was being acknowledged. There's a difference, a significant one. Prince Bastian guided me directly to the VIP table. The chair beside his remained empty. Apparently, it had been waiting for me. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Neither was the reaction. Guests exchanged glances. Whispers spread. Questions circulated. Who is she? Why is the prince escorting her? What happened? For once, I didn't feel obligated to answer. The people who mattered already knew. Prince Bastian waited until I sat down before taking his own seat. Only then did dinner resume. Only then did conversations begin again. Only then did the reception continue. Not because he was a prince, because he had made a point, and everyone understood it. My parents returned to their table eventually. Mallory returned too. The wedding continued. The speeches happened. The dancing happened. The cake was cut. The photographs were taken. From a distance, everything looked normal, but the atmosphere had changed permanently, not for the guests, for my family. Every now and then I would catch my mother looking in my direction. Not with guilt. Something more complicated. Recognition. As if she had spent years looking at a photograph and only now met the actual person. Near the end of the evening, Prince Bastian quietly asked if I'd like some fresh air. That sounded significantly better than another conversation about campaign fundraising. So we slipped away. No entourage, no cameras, no audience. Just two people leaving a noisy ballroom. The balcony overlooked the estate grounds. Most of the guests remained inside dancing. The music reached us only as a distant murmur. For the first time all day, everything felt quiet. We sat near the railing. No ceremony, no formality, just conversation. The kind soldiers have when nobody is trying to impress anyone. We talked about people, not accomplishments, not medals, not titles, people. A combat engineer who could fix anything except his own coffee machine. A helicopter pilot who carried lucky jelly beans on every mission. A medic who somehow treated patients while telling terrible jokes. Names, faces, memories. The people who never appear in official photographs. The people who actually matter. At one point, Prince Bastien laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. I hadn't heard that sound all evening. Not in the ballroom. Not during the reception. Not during the photographs. Out here, the commander was more visible than the prince, which probably explained everything. Eventually, the conversation slowed. The estate lights glowed across the property. The music continued in the distance. And for a while, neither of us said anything. The silence felt comfortable. Not heavy, just complete. I thought about the peach chiffon dress. The one that had started all of this. The one designed to help me disappear. Funny thing. The dress had worked perfectly. My family had hidden me exactly where they wanted. Behind the ballroom, behind the photographs, behind the image. What they failed to understand was something much simpler. Worth doesn't shrink because someone ignores it. Honor doesn't disappear because someone overlooks it. And dignity has never depended on where you're seated. The people who truly understand value don't search for it under chandeliers. They look for it where the real work happens. Sometimes that means a battlefield. Sometimes it means a hospital. Sometimes it means a kitchen corridor behind a luxury ballroom. I never received an apology that night. I didn't ask for one. I didn't need one. Because the most important lesson arrived without a speech. You don't have to fight your way into the row of a room determined to make you smaller. You don't have to beg for recognition. You don't have to prove your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. Your value already exists. And sooner or later, the right people will walk through the back door to find it. A few weeks after the wedding, I found myself thinking less about Prince Bastien and more about something my mother had said. "You look so normal." Out of everything that happened that day, that was the sentence that stayed with me, not because it was the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to me. It wasn't. I've heard worse. I've worked around people under stress, fear, exhaustion, and pain. Trust me, human beings can come up with far more creative things to say. What bothered me was how ordinary the comment sounded. My mother didn't say it to hurt me. She said it because she genuinely believed it was a compliment. That realization took me longer to process than the entire wedding. For years, I thought the problem was that my family didn't appreciate what I did. I thought if I explained my work better, maybe they would understand. If I shared more stories, maybe they would understand. If I brought them into my world, maybe they would understand. Eventually, I learned something uncomfortable. Not everyone is capable of seeing value in the same things. That doesn't automatically make them bad people. It just means they're using a different measuring stick. My family measured success through visibility, status, connections, recognition, the ability to walk into a room and have people know your name. The military taught me to measure something different: responsibility, competence, trust. The ability to walk into a crisis and have people know you'll do your job. Those aren't the same thing. And the older I get, the more I realize how often people confuse attention with value. We've built entire industries around being noticed. Social media rewards being noticed. Marketing rewards being noticed. Politics rewards being noticed. Entertainment rewards being noticed. Very few systems reward quiet competence. The person doing excellent work in the background rarely gets a standing ovation. Most of the time, they just get more work. I know some of you listening understand exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you're the responsible sibling, the one everybody calls when something breaks, the one who handles emergencies, the one who pays attention, the one who shows up. Yet somehow, you're never the person people celebrate. Maybe you're the employee who trains new hires, fixes problems, and keeps things moving while someone else gets the promotion because they're better at talking about their accomplishments. Maybe you're a teacher, a nurse, a firefighter, a paramedic, a military veteran, a parent. Or maybe you're just someone who quietly carries responsibilities nobody else notices. If that's you, I want to tell you something I wish I had understood years ago. Being overlooked does not reduce your value. It only reveals where other people are looking. That's an important difference. For a long time, I wasted energy trying to earn recognition from people who were focused on entirely different things. Not because they were evil, not because they hated me, because they simply weren't looking in that direction. Imagine spending years trying to convince someone to appreciate classical music when they're only interested in football scores. You can explain, you can perform, you can educate, you can argue, None of it matters if their attention is somewhere else. The wedding finally forced me to confront that reality. My family wasn't withholding approval because I hadn't earned it. They weren't waiting for one more deployment, one more achievement, one more award, one more success story. They simply valued different things, and once I accepted that, something surprising happened. I stopped feeling angry. Anger requires expectation. The moment you stop expecting someone to become a different person, a lot of frustration disappears. That doesn't mean you lower your standards. It doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean you become a doormat. It simply means you stop building your emotional life around someone else's inability to understand you. That's freedom. Real freedom. Not getting the apology, not winning the argument, not proving them wrong. Freedom is no longer needing the verdict. I think that's why the moment in the kitchen mattered so much. It wasn't because a prince saluted me. It wasn't because my family was embarrassed. It wasn't because the room suddenly saw me differently. The important moment happened much earlier. The important moment happened when I walked away from the head table. When I stopped competing for space inside a picture that wasn't built for me. When I stopped trying to convince people to see what they had spent years overlooking. That decision mattered more than the salute. Because by the time Prince Bastian found me, I had already chosen myself. And if there's one lesson I hope you take from this story, this is: don't spend your life auditioning for acceptance. Don't build your self-worth around other people's recognition. Don't hand someone else the authority to decide whether your contributions matter. Know who you are. Know what you've done. Know what you stand for. Then keep moving. The people who truly understand value may not find you immediately. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. But when they do, you'll discover something remarkable. The right people never needed convincing in the first place. The older I get, the less interested I am in who got the last word. What interests me now is who learned something useful. Because if a story only entertains you for an hour, it disappears. But if it changes the way you see your own life, it stays with you. One of the reasons I wanted to share this experience is because the wedding wasn't really about a wedding. It wasn't even about my family. At its core, it was about something millions of people deal with every day: being underestimated, being overlooked, being treated like supporting cast in somebody else's story. And the truth is, it happens in places that have nothing to do with luxury estates or royal guests. It happens at work. It happens at home. It happens in friendships. It happens in marriages. It happens between parents and children. Sometimes it happens for so long that people start accepting it as normal. I know a lot of listeners probably recognize one particular role immediately: the responsible one. Every family seems to have one. The person everyone calls when they need help moving. The person who handles emergencies. The person who remembers birthdays. The person who takes care of aging parents. The person who quietly solves problems while everyone else argues about them. Strangely enough, that person is often the least celebrated. People get used to reliability. That's one of the strange side effects of competence. When you're dependable, people stop noticing how much you're carrying. The work becomes invisible because it's always getting done. I've seen the same thing in professional environments. Some of the most capable people I've ever worked with were not the loudest. They weren't the best at self-promotion. They weren't constantly reminding everyone how important they were. They were simply good at their jobs. The problem is that modern culture often rewards visibility before it rewards value. Think about that for a second. Visibility comes first. Value comes later, sometimes much later. A person can become famous without being useful. A person can be incredibly useful without becoming famous. Those are completely different measurements. And somewhere along the way, a lot of people started confusing them. Social media didn't create this problem. It just amplified it. Every day we're shown carefully edited versions of other people's lives. Promotions, vacations, luxury purchases, achievements, milestones, perfect photographs, perfect lighting, perfect moments. What we rarely see is the work underneath, the failures, the discipline, the sacrifices, the years spent becoming capable. The wedding reminded me of something important. The room was filled with people chasing appearances. The kitchen was filled with people producing results. One group was talking about the event. The other group was making the event happen. And honestly, that's a distinction worth remembering. Because life eventually exposes the difference. Not immediately. Not dramatically. but consistently. If you're building real skills, real character, and real competence, there will be moments when those things matter. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, maybe not even next year. But eventually, the opposite is also true. A polished image can open a door. It cannot keep you in the room forever. Sooner or later, reality asks questions. Sooner or later, performance meets pressure. Sooner or later, substance becomes more valuable than presentation. I've seen that happen everywhere, in military units, in hospitals, in businesses, in families. The people who survive difficult situations are rarely the people with the best image. They're usually the people with the strongest foundation. That's why I want to offer a practical challenge to anyone listening. The next time you feel overlooked, ask yourself one question. Are you chasing attention, or are you building value? Because those paths often lead in different directions. Attention feels good. Everybody likes being noticed. There's nothing wrong with that. But attention is temporary. Value compounds. Attention depends on other people. Value belongs to you. Attention can disappear overnight. Value travels with you everywhere. One of the biggest mistakes I made in my 20s was believing recognition and worth were connected. I thought if enough people appreciated what I did, then I would feel secure. Turns out it doesn't work that way. Security comes first. Recognition comes second. Sometimes not at all, and that's okay. Because your life is too important to place in the hands of public opinion. Whether that opinion comes from strangers online, coworkers in an office, or relatives sitting around a holiday table, your value cannot depend on who notices it. That's an unstable foundation. Instead, build your life around things nobody can take away. Character, discipline, integrity, competence, reliability, the ability to help others, the ability to keep your word, the ability to do difficult things when nobody is watching. Those qualities don't generate headlines. They generate respect. And while respect often arrives later than attention, it tends to stay much longer once it gets there. If there's one thing I learned from that wedding, it's this. Never let a room full of people convince you that appearances matter more than substance. Because eventually the lights dim, the music stops, the photographs get put away. And when all of that disappears, the only thing left is who you actually are. That's the part worth investing in. If I could sit down with my 20-year-old self for 10 minutes, I know exactly where we'd meet. Not at the wedding, not at the estate, not on that balcony. We'd meet in a military recruiting office. The version of me sitting there would be nervous, stubborn, and completely convinced she had something to prove. She would think success meant earning respect. She would think accomplishment meant finally being seen. She would think that if she worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and achieved enough, everyone around her would eventually understand her value. And honestly, I wouldn't argue with her. Most of those beliefs came from a good place. Hard work matters, discipline matters, commitment matters. I would never tell my younger self to care less. I would never tell her to lower her standards. I would never tell her to stop showing up for people. The world already has enough people looking for shortcuts. What I would tell her is something much simpler. Don't confuse love with understanding. That lesson took me years to learn. Some people love you and still don't understand you. Some people care about you and still fail to see who you are. Some people genuinely want the best for you while having absolutely no idea what the best actually looks like. When I was younger, I thought those things were contradictions. Now I understand they're part of being human. My parents weren't villains. That's important. That's mistakes, big ones, painful ones. But they weren't cartoon villains sitting around plotting ways to hurt me. The truth was more ordinary and more uncomfortable. They simply valued different things, the same way many families do, the same way many people do. The problem came when I spent years trying to earn validation from a system that measured success differently than I did. That's exhausting. A lot of people listening right now are probably doing exactly that. Maybe it's with family. Maybe it's with friends. Maybe it's with coworkers. Maybe it's with someone you love. You're constantly trying to explain yourself, constantly trying to justify your choices, constantly hoping that one more achievement will finally make everything click. One more promotion, one more degree, one more accomplishment, one more success. The finish line keeps moving, and eventually you realize something. You aren't running toward acceptance. You're running toward approval. Those are not the same thing. Approval is conditional. Acceptance isn't. Approval says, I'll value you if. Acceptance says, I value you, period. The wedding taught me that distinction more clearly than any deployment ever could. People often assume the most important moment was when Prince Bastien saluted me. It wasn't. That was the moment everyone remembers. It wasn't the moment that changed me. The moment that changed me happened earlier. It happened when I stopped trying to earn a seat at a table that required me to become smaller. It happened when I walked away from the head table. It happened when I chose peace over performance. By the time Prince Bastien found me, something important had already happened. I had stopped chasing permission. That's why the salute mattered. Not because it created my value, because it confirmed a value that already existed. There's a huge difference. Too many people spend their lives waiting for someone else to declare them worthy. A parent, a boss, a spouse, an audience, a stranger online, whoever it happens to be. The problem is that you're handing over ownership of something that should belong to you. Your worth cannot be outsourced. Nobody gets to issue it. Nobody gets to revoke it. Nobody gets to decide whether it exists. The only thing other people can do is recognize it, or fail to recognize it. Either way, it remains there. That's something I wish I had understood much sooner. And if you've stayed with me through this entire story, maybe that's the message I hope you take with you. Stop waiting for permission to respect yourself. Stop waiting for unanimous approval. Stop waiting for everyone to understand. Some people never will. That's okay. You don't need everybody. You need the right people. The people who value integrity. The people who recognize effort. The people who respect character. The people who notice what happens behind the scenes. Those people exist. Sometimes they're family, sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're complete strangers, and sometimes they walk through a kitchen door when you least expect it. Before I go, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible despite doing everything right? Have you ever worked hard, shown up consistently, and still felt overlooked? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. Leave a comment below. I read more of them than you might think, and if this story meant something to you, take a moment to subscribe. Every day we share stories about family, resilience, dignity, self-respect, and the quiet victories that rarely make headlines but often shape entire lives. New stories premiere daily at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Until next time, remember this, your worth is not determined by who notices it. Your worth is revealed by what you choose to do with it.